Hi, I'm Joe Lowenstein. I'm the director of the Interdisciplinary Project in Humanities. It's my privilege and my pleasure to introduce this year's Distinguished Humanities Lecturer. Over the past few years, IPH, usually with the support of the Center for the Humanities, has hosted some remarkable scholars. Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Marilynne Robinson, a few years earlier, the great theorist of race and the law, Patricia Williams. Historians like Gary Wills, Sean Wilentz, Lynn Hunt, or Caroline Walker Bynum. Occasionally, we've treated ourselves to lectures by one of our own colleagues. At the last of our Distinguished Humanities Lecture Series, we celebrated the inauguration of the new University Chancellor with 3 lectures on Michelangelo by Bill Wallace. Today, we're celebrating Dean Hu's Digital Transformations Initiative with 3 lectures on How to Live Playfully by Ian Bogost, Professor of Computer Science and Engineering and Director of the Program in Film and Media Studies. I'm an enthusiast, a fan, although I have to confess that I was late to discover Professor Bogost's work. I first learned about him from Doug Knox, my colleague in the Humanities Digital Workshop, who was helping me pull together a digital humanities seminar for graduate students, postdocs, faculty, and staff back in 2013. I was looking around for work around which to organize a week on digital humanities, DH, as an intellectual practice that seemed to have an unusual utility as a vector for making academic work interesting and accessible to wider publics. And Doug was confident that if that was to be our topic, then we should devote the whole week to the career of Ian Bogost. So I started reading and discovered what many of you know, that Professor Bogost is one of the preeminent scholars of contemporary digital culture, that he is especially formidable as an analyst of video games, and that he has had special impact for his work on the rhetoric of gaming, for his conception of gaming as a form of persuasion, as indeed a model form of persuasion. Some of you will know that Ian is not only someone who can teach, but someone who can do. That he is not only a theorist of gaming with a PhD in comparative literature, but he is also a maker of games. And yet there's more. He writes books for scholars and columns for anyone who reads, and columns for avid consumers of The Atlantic. And I commend that public writing to anyone who reads for pleasure. Because Ian's prose is not only brilliant, incisive, and funny, but often so beautifully rhythmed that you'd think he got editorial help from Ginger Baker or Errol Garner. Unless this introduction seemed to be all warmth and sweetness, I'll add that brilliant, funny, incisive, rhythmic prose is that his brilliant, funny, incisive, rhythmic prose is also pungently acidic. If you track some of his work in the areas of design aesthetics or object-oriented ontology, or his commentary on academic practice, you will quickly discover that Ian Bogost is a very sturdy, very energetic controversialist. During his time here, he's shown himself to be a kind and supportive colleague. But on the page, and even sometimes in the seminar room, he has elbows. Brainy elbows, if you'll permit the anatomical paradox. And it's for his controversial gusto that many of his colleagues most cherish him. He's diabolically tart on social media, and it's a joy to see the fervors that shimmer and flare when he's part of an online wrangle over the methods and values of education and critical practice. He has principles, and he seems more interested in arguing for them than in merely nurturing them in comfortable privacy. So I'm delighted that he agreed to give this year's lectures, and especially delighted that he agreed to speak on one of his favorite topics, on play, on playfulness. Bogost's interest in play was one of the things that excited me when Doug Knox first brought his work to my attention. Although I'm afraid that I had jumped hastily to improper conclusions about his interest. I was sure that his interest in play would place him in a long and now slightly embarrassing tradition in the humanities, a tradition that recalls that what we call the liberal arts are the arts of free persons, people with enough leisure, enough freedom from necessity to pursue philosophy, write poetry, make music, play games, waste time and resources. As you'll see, Ian's relation to this tradition is both oblique and contrary. He does not simply oppose play to work, and he has a richly controversial understanding of what fun is. I promise that his lecture today, A Theory of Play, is going to surprise you as much as he has surprised me as I've gotten to know his work, and I expect you'll be as glad to have attended this lecture and the ones to follow on Wednesday and Thursday as I have been to welcome him to a rowdy place among us. Ian.
Thank you so much. That was so kind. I'm already flummoxed, you know. Okay, let me get my tech working. I'm really deeply humbled that all of you have chosen to spend some of your time with me this afternoon, and time is sort of the only resource that any of us have, and I'm going to do my best to honor my place as a guest in your schedules. As Joe indicated, this is the first of 3 lectures in a series titled How to Live Playfully. And I want to spend just a few minutes offering a preview of the journey I hope to take you on this week. These 3 talks won't compose a continuous singular argument, but nor are they discrete and independent from one another either. I hope that it will feel something more like an ocean cruise, perhaps, with stops at 3 ports. And the cruise, by the way, is just your life, the one that you've been living without me up until now, in which you'll return to after we part company. The first of these stops is about play and what it is and why it's so hard to understand what it is, let alone to try to practice it. So that's what's about to happen to you tonight. The second is about the structure of play, and in particular, how much play, which, and maybe this is a spoiler, is going to end up feeling very close to meaning, how much play relies on external conditions of the world rather than internal ones of the mind. And the third is about what to do with those insights, if indeed they prove to be insights, how to turn them into a way of living rather than an abstract philosophy. And if you make it all the way till the end, you'll see that this is the question that I'm both most interested in and struggle with. If you can attend just one of these talks, then today's not a bad choice, which is good because you're here already. But I hope to earn your interest in attending the others. So that's my talk about talking. And now I'm going to start with the actual talk. Many years ago now, I was running an errand at a local shopping mall. I still lived in Atlanta at the time. I don't remember what I was doing, what I needed, or why, but I was in a hurry. And I know it was the weekend, and the mall was crowded in a way that it just doesn't get anymore. And it was just bleak. All I wanted to do was get in and get out and leave. But I had my young daughter with me, and she was, I think, about 4 years old at the time. And she didn't want to be there either. But I was afraid of her getting lost, and she was too. And so she clutched onto my hand as I steered us through the throngs of shoppers trying to get wherever it was I was going. And I was moving too fast for her little legs, and she was struggling to keep up with me. I was irritated already, but as we walked, I got more so. I could feel her taking these quick steps to keep up with me, and she was tugging back, and she was pulling me in other directions. And when I looked down, ready to be annoyed that she was dallying as I was trying to do whatever it was I was doing, I finally saw why. And she was staring straight down at her shoes, timing her footfalls so that she stepped within the boundaries of the white square tiles lining the mall floor. And what I had interpreted as these pulls and tugs as her trying to maybe look at something to the side or go somewhere different than where I intended, those had really been shifts in her weight as she attempted to avoid, violating the grout lines while I pulled her through and around the crowds. Now, if you've been around for a while, or not even that long at all, you'll recognize what she was doing because you've probably done it yourself. It's a variant on the step on a crack, break your mother's back game. And this is actually a ritual, or it's a kind of received children's ritual that began life as a superstition at the turn of the 20th century and only later developed into a children's game for sidewalks. But this isn't the sort of thing that you really learn at home or on the playground anymore. My daughter didn't know any of that history. She just rediscovered the game on her own. But hers was different, too. It was actually a better rendition. It added some intrigue. She had been forced to subject herself to my cadence, for one thing. And I was leading her by the hand, so she didn't have to look where she was going. And that limitation of not being able to choose which direction she moved in, also created a new freedom. It allowed her to focus on her feet rather than all the human obstacles tumbling toward her and me together. Almost made the thing like a carnival ride, a makeshift one at that. Vertiginous, challenging, pleasurable, weird. It was altogether much more interesting a trip to the store than I was having. She made the most of this mundane situation, whereas I had utterly failed to do so. Now, the words, the concepts that we use to describe this sort of thing, this sort of situation, they are so familiar that they've almost become meaningless. She made up a game, or she was playing, or she was having fun. These are words that are good enough for casual conversation, but not for much more, not even for understanding at that casual level what my daughter was doing or what anyone else does when they do these things, let alone what we might learn from those lessons. Now, as a game designer and critic and historian, one of the things that's always struck me about this field, if that's even a word we ought to use for it, is how little we seem to understand much of anything about our object of interest, we game critics and designers and theorists. If you talk to novelists or filmmakers or painters or knitters or small batch spirit makers or anyone else, not to mention their audiences, all of them have a pretty good sense of what it is they are doing, what their subjects are, what it means to create or critique under those circumstances. But if you ever meet a player or a designer of games, just try this out. It always works. Ask them questions like, oh, you're a game designer. what is a game anyway? Or, I like to play games. They're a lot of fun, but I don't really even know what that means. What does it mean to have fun when you play? I mean, when you talk to them, their hearts will just sink and drop from their bodies because we just kind of don't know. And it's so bad. We know so little about this subject. It's so bad that one of the working definitions of game is this churlish take: the historical process by which the term game has been characterized and understood, which is just charming, yeah. At this point, you may be thinking about this guy, the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who, of course, argued that terms like this, sort of used game as an object lesson, that terms like game can only be defined by what he called family resemblance. That is, no one set of features describes something like games, but this kind of murky group of shifting and overlapping properties. And we can point to this and say, aha, there you go. That's why I don't know what I'm talking about. It's a little bit like donuts. This is my favorite way of explaining Wittgensteinian family resemblance. Like, what makes these things donuts is that they come in the donut box. But this is also the kind of observation that explains why people tend not to like philosophers. It just doesn't feel like it gets us much closer to knowledge or understanding, but just to talking about the idea of knowledge and understanding. Would that we had some. And here's where the philosophers will remind you that it's the love of wisdom, not the possession of it. Yeah. But there is one renowned 20th century philosopher, it's not Wittgenstein, philosopher of play, that people do actually revere and listen to and have taken advice from with respect to this question about a supposedly deep and influential take on games and fun and play and what they mean. And that philosopher is, of course, Mary Poppins. Now, in this audience, you may know Mary Poppins as a character from novels, but most everyone knows her as via the Walt Disney version of herself, the Walt Disney's rendering of the Victorian nanny, in which she offers a quite distinctive and memorable theory of play and fun, which all of you know, it's in your heads already, and I'm going to draw it out again, which is this, right, that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. This is Mary Poppins' theory of what fun feels like. And in the Disney film, the medicine is, or at least the way that it's most effectively depicted in the film, the medicine is this undesirable task of like cleaning up the Banks children's room, and the sugar, it's quite abstract actually, when you think about it. This is a quite postmodern moment in this film. The sugar is not sugar, but the act of performing the song about making chores less horrible. It's the sing-song part that's the sugar. All right. So this produces joy in the children that Mary Poppins oversees. They are fictional children, I would point out, but it produces joy in them. And I won't judge anyone who takes life advice from musicals. They're delightful, but it might also not be the most reliable source of deep meaning and insight. And if you stop yourself as a hermeneuticist, if you will, and listen closely to the lyrics, actually it's quite confusing. It's a quite confusing take. Mary Poppins ends up offering only 2 examples of her theory. One of them is a robin that sings a song while fashioning a nest. This is one metaphor. The other is, you remember it? It's a honeybee that enjoys a sweet sip of nectar while buzzing from bud to bud. This is the kind of thing that I hear and I look at and I think about. I mean, really? worker bees. Worker bees store their nectar in a pouch. It's called a crop, and then they regurgitate it upon returning to the hive. That's what the bee does. The bee is not sort of like snacking, exactly, and it's also not clear that the robin is like, I have to build a nest again, right? But it does strike me that these examples, I mean, whether they're good or not, they're sort of mismatches. They don't quite match up with the prim Victorian fun that Mary Poppins, the character, would endorse in the first place. But this is a terrifically influential idea, maybe the most influential idea in the theory of play. You can quote me on that if you'd like. And yet, it offers considerably less advice about enjoyment than it appears to. Essentially, if you were to summarize it, if you were to add it all up, what the spoonful of sugar concept recommends is covering over drudgery. We're supposed to believe that the robin's song hides the just mind-addling boredom of nest building. And in the same way, the Poppins song hides this afflictive boredom of cleanup. And this totally, utterly works in the context of the musical because the cleanup, the medicine, is abstracted. It only takes as much time as the song does to sing, which is extremely convenient. But of course, that's not how real work works. My entire house is covered with dust because we've been remodeling, and I think about this when I think about Mary Poppins, which I think about all the time. And if I set out to sing the song in order to move the task forward, I would just lose my marbles. Like, far from being fun, 1 or 3 or 10 choruses down a spoonful of sugar, then you would just lose your shit, right? Now, in the world of educational technology, which is a circle that I sometimes run in, this idea, whether attributed to Mary Poppins or not, has become an insult. We insult advice like spoonful of sugar with the name chocolate-covered broccoli. And, you know, it's like, oh, we want children to learn something. Well, let's cover it up with something they want, because what they don't want is to learn. Here's some spaceships to go on top of the math problems. And it's an insult because it's a bad idea. Most of the time, we can come back to it. Like, it's cute for a minute, like, oh, spaceships, that's nice. But then, you know, very quickly, kids are smart. Like, the cold reality sets in. This is actually this is math problems, is what this is, you know. And if you separate these out, you'll see the problem. The problem is that chocolate is amazing. Chocolate is great. It's delightful. It's sweet. We want it. But that doesn't mean that broccoli is made better when you put chocolate atop it. It's just a mismatch. Even if we were to accept the idea, though, this spoonful of sugar business, it doesn't really prescribe some sort of method for making unpleasant things pleasant anyway. It's actually kind of surprising to me that no one's bothered to do this work on the song before. But if you take a look at this little sort of spoken word introduction, and every job that must be done, there is an element of fun. You find the fun and snap, the job's a game, which is just, I mean, it's terrific. I actually have known people who use this as like their email signature and that kind of thing, because it's quotable and it's lyrical and delightful, and we all love Mary Poppins, right? But if you try to follow this advice, they just like sit back and go, okay, here's my method, I'm going to follow it. Like, if an element of fun is hidden in every job, then what? How do you find it? Where do you look? By what process besides this supernatural snap, you know, the magic of the magical nanny, does the job become a game? And if you step back for even a moment, you'll see that a spoonful of sugar tells us something that we already know, which is that things are more enjoyable when they're not less enjoyable. It's a tautology, essentially. A job seems less fun if it seems less fun, so just make your jobs funner, and they'll be more fun. Part of the problem, though, it's not just Mary Poppins' fault. Part of the problem comes from this idea itself, this concept, this word fun, which is a term that we use without much thought for its meaning either. And there are lots and lots of terms and phrases like this. A lot of ordinary speech doesn't really have meaning. It serves a social function rather than an expressive one. And linguists have a name for this. They call it phatic communication. So when you go into the store and, or go into the office, a shopkeeper or a colleague asks you, "How are you?" They don't really care. They don't mean to ask you how you're doing, but they're simply saying hello. They're acknowledging your presence. And then when you say, "Yeah, I'm fine, thanks," you're just returning the greeting. You exist, I exist, yes, I see you, we're here, we're doing the thing. And it would actually be quite strange and unwelcome to describe how you're really and truly feeling. And many times, this is a very American thing too, and oftentimes folks will come from abroad into America and they'll go into a store and they'll go, why are you always asking me about myself? I'm just trying to live my life here, But even seemingly significant phrases get deflated like this. They become phatic and they sort of take on this weird function. Like the first time you tell someone, "I love you," this is sort of mythologized and it's momentous and it marks this moment, or at least in theory it does, at this new level of intensity and commitment in a relationship. But then weeks or months or years or decades later, "I love you" is actually a lot more like "how are you, I'm fine." It just sort of reinforces the expected state of affairs. Like, we're okay, everything's okay, love you, I'm going out, love you too, bye-bye. And in fact, over time, this phrase, it only bears meaning when it's withheld, when it's not uttered but typically would have been, and then that something's wrong. You're in trouble, you did something, "I love you." So fun is that kind of a word. It's a placeholder more than a description. And like "how are you," when you say "did you have fun" or "I had fun," it's largely a courtesy. It was okay. Everything's fine. Nothing went wrong. Like, I'm back home after having been out. And the weird part is that sort of functional phatic aspect of fun has sort of transferred itself to the aesthetic realm. So when you play a game, "this is a fun game," it actually means very little. Sort of like, "that was a good book. It was an okay movie. How was dinner?" It does little more than sort of showing the speaker's general endorsement. And it may even do less than that, since other kinds of media or art forms, they don't tend to enforce this singular metric of aesthetic value. But in games, not only do we do that, but we don't notice that we do it, and then we celebrate not noticing that we do it. Like, fun is a first-order aesthetic measure. It's the metric of quality. A good game has to be fun, Like, that's the same kind of sentiment that you might hear from an adolescent boy on an internet forum as you would hear from a big entertainment company CEO on an earnings call. And it's both reasonable, but at the same time, like, oddly vacant. And if you tried to transfer this rationale to other creative domains, you wouldn't tolerate it, I don't think. Like, what critic or consumer or creator would take an art seriously if its aesthetic ambition were something just as vague as being generally good? It's a kind of third-rate, like Clown Town kind of assessment. So some of my colleagues have tried to take a swing at this. In a book called A Theory of Fun, which has been broadly influential in the game design and game education communities, the game designer Raf Koster picks this idea up and actually rejoins his professional kin for their weirdly blinkered attitude toward fun. And he says this: "No other artistic medium defines itself around an intended effect on the user, such as fun. They all embrace a wider array of emotional impact." So there's a couple of interesting things about this brief quip. And the first is that Coster does not appear to be bothered by this squishy imprecision of this word, but rather at the notion that fun is the only emotional impact that's of concern to games. Interesting. So it's as if we had a general agreement about the nature of that emotional impact in the first place, such that we would know what it would mean to exceed it in the way that he wants to endorse. And then second, rather than trying to expand the capacity of games to include those wider arrays of emotional impact, and he has in mind things like sorrow or tenderness or regret, for example. Instead, Coster ends up suggesting something like the opposite, that actually fun has a greater capacity than we have acknowledged. We've underestimated what fun can do. And his reinterpretation of fun in the book ends up being related to cognition and to learning, which is kind of a downer when you think about it. Fun becomes the good feeling we get when we identify patterns and solve problems. This is one of the ways that we try to recycle the off-the-books pleasure of games back onto the record in a productive way. And it's a common sentiment, the idea that people learn through play. And it's fine. I've spent a lot of my career making arguments like this. But it's also a little bit of a Mary Poppins tautology, too, when you think about it. The most enjoyable kind of learning is the most enjoyable kind. Fun is the funnest way to learn. But there's still some sense that's hidden within this nonsense if we dig a little deeper. As phatic speech, I think fun is kind of a surrogate term, or maybe like a pigeon, a fusion of condensed bits and pieces, a stand-in for all of these replacements. And how this happened and why it did is murky, but there are some clues. Fun is appears to be like a uniquely English word that seems to have arisen from fun in Middle English, which means like a fool, or to make a fool of, or to be a fool. And this is an esoteric meaning that's still with us a little bit today. Like don't poke fun at me is one way that you would say that. But it's a far less common usage than the usual sense of like amusement, enjoyment that we normally associate with these terms. And foolishness, this is not something that we construe as a virtue, generally speaking, at least not today. But the fool, it doesn't have to be a pejorative. The flip side of foolishness is commitment. Instead of maintaining the standard way of things, what the fool does is ask, well, what else is possible? And then the real fool carries out those possibilities, no matter how outlandish they might be. And this, in fact, is essentially the job description of the jester, the original fool, to say and do what no other agent could in the court. So folly and fun are related, and what folly does is it creates surprise. And it creates that surprise by showing us something new, through exploration rather than through witlessness. The fool finds something new in a familiar situation. So they test this out. A friend, your roommate, whomever returns from an evening out, and you're being polite, so you say, "How was your night?" And she responds, "Oh, it was fun." So what does she really mean? What is going on? What is underneath that sentiment? Well, even with the same friends, at the same bar, after the same day, at the same job, with the same hot wings and the same complaints, still, nevertheless, the evening resulted in some new discovery. You know, the way that a sense of humor responded to a new story, or the way that a face blanketed a new worry with a kind of familiar comfort. So just like I love you, we had fun. It's shorthand. It's a stand-in for all the poetry that we're too embarrassed to write. And this is where the Mary Poppins kind of thinking leads us astray. Because what a spoonful of sugar does is it covers something over. It weighs it down, too. It hides it. It transforms it from what it is into what it is not. It turns it into a lie. And it does so brazenly by assuming that the situation itself is always insufficient, that it's incapable of anything more than has already been thought about it. You know, in that sing-song job, it's okay for a movie, but when the cold reality of the big, messy room or the long, boring flight faces us, then the song and dance number becomes an affectation. And then we feel guilty about it because we were weaned on these children's stories that taught us that what we bring to the table is what matters the most, and anything else is just you being lazy or ungrateful. And this is like a first-order social problem, I think. It's not just a problem for children. Mary Poppins' false lesson is everywhere, and it's not entirely our fault either. In our secular age, meaning has to come from within us. There's just no longer an agreed-upon external source of meaning or virtue or value. These are the roles that were once played by gods or by kings or just by cultural homogeneity. And so we have to constantly reinvent it to find that new value in our lives by sheer force of will. And it's unsustainable. That demand is just eating us alive. But in the face of this hardship, what we've done is sort of receded even further inside ourselves. And so when we are faced with almost anything at all, we have this default response of skepticism and of resistance, that giving it a sort of careful wink and a sneer is the best way to proceed. I think the best summary of the way that we express that anxiety is with irony. That we have this sense that anything could go wrong at any moment, and that everything has become duplicitous and untrustworthy, and so we hold them at arm's length and then we theorize about them, or we laugh at them rather than putting them to use. And this idea, especially in the last 10 years or so, irony has been kind of declared an affectation of cultural life, of the internet age, of hipsters. And it's a kind of unfair and unhelpful idea, but nevertheless, the caricature of hipster irony can help us see it clearly. So here's an example that I found a while back that I just love. An ad for a bike on Craigslist. And in this ad, a self-declared failed hipster is trying to sell this fixie bike for like $1,600. And the ad reads, "I tried so hard. I dated a girl from Portland. I criticized cheese. I burned and singed my forearms just to make it look like I was going to culinary school." And it goes on like this. It's good, right? It's like you get it. You're chuckling. And like, what do you do with this? It was an actual ad on Craigslist, right? Like, the ad can't be real, but it can't be fake, because he's advertising a bike, unless he's not advertising a bike. He's putting on a joke about. And so it kind of refuses to choose. And you can't really ever buy the bike even if you buy it, but you can sort of buy the idea of the bike. Or maybe a better way of putting this is that pondering the idea of buying the bike, or tweeting about the idea of buying the bike, that takes the place of other sorts of leisure activities, like watching sitcoms or knitting or whatever it is that you used to do with your time. Now, if we zoom all the way back, in the traditional sense, and there's many traditional senses, but the received traditional sense of irony, it means saying or doing the opposite of what you mean. But now it's changed into something different and and worse, like refusing to reveal whether or not you mean not to mean what you say or do. And this whole apparatus, this whole kind of irony, exists to keep reality at a distance. And I think what it's done is it's become our primary method for combating the external world's potential incompatibility with our desires and our expectations. You know, faced with the threat of disappointment or duplicity or what have you, it feels safer just to seal components of the world off for everyone's protection. And you know, for decades now, people have complained about this, and irony has had its critics since there's been irony. One of the most splashy, at least at the time, came about a decade ago now. And this was right when internet life had become just life. And a then new assistant professor of French at Princeton named Christy Wampel, assistant professor of French at Princeton is a pretty seriously unironic circumstance to be in, by the way. She called it, in this accusatory New York Times op-ed, irony is just an escape route. It's a kind of credit card that you never have to pay back. And you know, that got some clicks because it's some good writing. But okay, like if you play that out, if irony is an escape route, then from what does it allow escape exactly? And one answer, Wampel's answer was, well, it's an escape from earnestness. It allows you to skirt earnestness. But that's also not quite right. It's really an escape from having to choose between earnestness and contempt. And when you wear the trucker cap, or you drink PBR, or whatever it is people do now, or you Instagram your pancake breakfast, like whatever it is, those things might be celebrations of the thing, and they might not. They might be send-ups. And you just can't know. And not knowing and not being able to know, this is what irony means today. And this happens just every single day, every hour on the internet. You just absolutely cannot escape it. I think it's understandable that this circumstance arose, that we're living at a time when anything could go wrong at any moment, or it feels that way. You might get stuck in traffic on the way home from the supermarket, or you might fail to find work after spending a fortune on a university education, or maybe the work that you do find is so pointless and soul-destroying that there's no point bothering with it in the first place, or even, let's say, just for example, that a global pandemic might make going to the supermarket dangerous, such that those who previously went begrudgingly and might have gotten stuck in traffic on the way home now find themselves weirdly missing going to the store, and those with no choice but to take up whatever job might be available have to go and put themselves at even greater risk than they were at already. So there are some justified fears, but we've rather overcompensated for them. We're so concerned that something might surprise us with disappointment or calamity that we resist engaging with it as a protection. Way, way back in 1994, before most people had access to the internet, the Canadian literary theorist Linda Hutcheon made this observation about irony, and she said that it only works within the bounds of discursive communities, and it relies heavily on local cultural context. Hutcheon knew back then that irony only worked when its speakers and interpreters share some kind of context. But she also couldn't have anticipated in that moment that context itself would essentially break forever, that contexts would become so numerous and so fragile as they are today. Sometimes they evolve and die out in a single week or even a single day. Here are just some examples I plucked from the internet last Friday that remix an egregious misinterpretation of the German Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant in a news article, which I wasn't even able to locate amidst the ire spewing about it, with the release of Taylor Swift's new album, which is actually a re-release of her old album, Red. And these kinds of things make it difficult to gain any context at all, let alone a shared one. And so every idea is just an inside joke. And increasingly, it's an inside joke for people in a room with no doors. Hutcheon anticipated the problem of these circumstances. The viewer or the reader or the consumer, she said, processes irony by oscillating between two or more seemingly incompatible meanings, searching one or the other for primacy or stability. And it's kind of like one of those Gestalt images, like the rabbit duck, which can be experienced as one or the other, but only processed as both or as neither through this like extremely deliberate higher order energy. And that kind of activity is fine every now and then. But Hutchin knew even 30 years ago that the demands irony places on the interpreter are serious and substantial, that absent a well-developed community in which to ground interpretive practice, that irony can confuse or fail, which was one of her interests. And the demands that irony issues become taxing. It feels critical, but becomes exhausting or impotent. The logical conclusion of Hutchin's theory came a decade later via an internet adage known as Poe's law, which I'm completely obsessed with. And Poe's law goes, without context, it's impossible to discern parody from extremism. So now, today, that exhaustion is just all that remains of irony. The critical edge has completely crumbled, and yet we still live amid those ruins, pretending as if they were an operational civilization. So as this kind of escape from choosing between earnestness and contempt, I would say that irony almost qualifies as a madness or a cultural illness, and I call it Ironoya. So if paranoia is the mistrust of people, then Ironoya is the mistrust of things. It's not this act of isolating things from one another in the world that's irony's problem. The problem is in isolating ourselves from all those other things as well. And so we end up in all these little bubble worlds that we can never properly commune with, like so many grandma's sofas covered in plastic. All right, well, what does that have to do with fun? Well, along with Mary Poppins, we assume that finding fun is a task that comes from us rather than from the things that we encounter. And then, worse, we've ironized everything so much that even the meanings we might somehow invent for those things that we encounter, they seem like immediately insufficient. Like, that's fine, but like, what if something better comes along? Let me just wait and see. But even simple, stupid, accidental experiences like my daughter's encounter with the mall show how wrong-headed this attitude is. You don't arrive at fun by expanding the circumstances to make them less wretched or waiting for less wretched circumstances to arrive. You do it by embracing the wretchedness of those circumstances themselves, which turn out to be a lot less wretched once you've relinquished the need to give them this meaning only in your head. Instead, that meaning and pleasure comes from allowing things to be just what they are, and then attempting to actively commune with those things as they are. The philosopher Bernard Sweets has argued that playing a game is defined as the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. What he means by this is that a game is something good enough on its own, something for which on its ownness is the point. And Sweets calls this willingness to accept the arbitrariness of games, the illusory attitude. Golf, for example, would be worse than a good walk spoiled, as the saying goes, were it like a Broadway song and dance number about dropping balls in holes. But if you reject golf because it is annoying or foolish or stupid, then you sort of miss the point, because the point is that golf is meant to be annoying and stupid and foolish. It's a game made from the accidental nuisances of the natural environment, which are sort of bent and twisted into a challenge. And in that is something like terrifying, because in a game like this, we see that sublimity is far more widespread and far more arbitrary than we like to think it is. And that's a really difficult truth to admit. We can take this further. Play isn't just in games. Like, we have these things that we talk about having play in them, like the a steering assembly has some play built in, the space through which the wheel can be turned before the shaft couples with the pinion at its end. Or we talk about the play of light and shadows, or a play on words. And play is really just the natural and necessary outcome of use or actions. And of course, we can't talk about play without talking about the philosopher Jacques Derrida, who put it this way: by orienting and organizing the coherence of the system, the center of a structure permits the free play of its elements inside the total form, which is very Derridian, but my friends, the game designers, Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman, sort of distilled that idea into a more functional, or at least more tractable definition, which is this one. It's just free movement within a more rigid structure. And when that use or action is deliberate and planned, then play becomes a kind of work. But not work like the job that you work at, not work like that, but work as in like working something, like the way that a carpenter works wood, or the way that a dancer works the floor. They're not processes of extracting enjoyment, and they're certainly not processes of doing whatever you want, but rather of subjecting yourself to the cold, hard reality of the world outside your head. And this is paradoxical. Play is an activity of freedom, where you get to exert control, but that freedom arises by reducing rather than expanding possibilities. Play is freedom through limitation rather than freedom from limitation. So my daughter's Step at a Crack game, it's not just that it's different than being whisked through the crowd, it's also bigger than that. She wasn't just doing whatever she wanted, irritated that I dragged her along to the mall. She was doing what the constraints of her situation allowed and invited. As Sweets puts it, play asks us to accomplish something using only means permitted by rules, where the rules prohibit more efficient in favor of less efficient means, and where such rules are accepted just because they make possible such activity. And you don't have to think about these as rules. Maybe that seems too bureaucratic. You can think of it instead as this encounter between limitation and constraint. So like take a musical instrument, like a guitar, which we talk about playing, at least in English we do. And when you play the guitar, you don't do whatever you want with it. Rather, you do something very particular. You hold its fretted fingerboard in certain patterns, and then you strum its strings in others, and that produces music, which is the aim. That's what the play is. So my contention is that you can do this with anything. You can play anything, like my daughter can play the ceramic floor tiles, or like Hendrix can play the Stratocaster. And that's because play is just a material property of things. And anything, whether it's steering columns and language and games, or it's dishwashers and puppies or whatever else. Play is just a material property of things. And it's a name for deliberately operating the constraints that we find in those things. And fun is the feeling of discovery that arises from that operation, finding something new in something familiar. So to do this well, we have to shift our perspective from play as an activity to play as a condition of things, and from fun as a goal to fun as an exhaust of respectful action, a feeling that's produced when an operator treats something with dignity. And that sounds kind of highfalutin or pretentious, but most of the time it doesn't look very remarkable, like taking something for what it really and truly is rather than what it isn't, and following that truth to its extreme, refusing to ironize it, bringing it close, asking how it works, what it does, what it can do, but hasn't done yet, what more there is to learn. You do that all the time, and the things that we tend to find the most fun aren't easy, but hard. They resist, they literally resist us, and that resistance is what's necessary to let the fun escape. If you want to have this fun, you have to let the thing you're playing be something other than you, bigger than you, and then you have to sort of trust it to pay dividends when you commune with it. And often you have to give it time to do so. Here's what that looks like, or at least an example. One summer, a decade ago now, John Isner and Nicholas Mahut played a match of tennis at Wimbledon that lasted 3 days. Neither one was able to break the other's service to tip the match, and each player served over 100 aces. At the end, you may have watched this, at the end, Isner finally bested Mahut with a 70-68 final set, and that's a score that exceeded the one at the buzzer at the US college basketball final that year. This is just a bananas amazing moment in the world. But if you ask, well, what happened here? Who was responsible for it? Was it the athletes or their trainers or the crowd sort of cheering them on to keep going? And maybe. But there's a more obvious answer, which is that what happened is just tennis itself. This possibility was always there inside the sport, just waiting. No, of course, the players contributed to it. They were implicated in it, but they didn't exactly create it. It's more like they found it. Like my daughter found something in the crowd in the mall. They found something in tennis. But unlike my daughter's discovery, theirs was something new, something that no one had found before, at least not at this level of international play, something that was preserved and durable, even as it was fragile and improbable, like a fossil at Pompeii. If fun is related to folly in this way, then it's kind of no wonder that the best examples look ridiculous or foolish, and it's because fools are the ones who are bonkers enough to persist when ordinary folk give up, which we do when the sing-song routine doesn't satisfy. If you like films or sushi or feeling oddly bad about liking either one, then you may have watched this documentary called Jiro Dreams of Sushi, which is about the sushi chef Jiro Ono, who had been making sushi every day for 75 years when this was filmed. He was sort of slowly honing his craft over decades of daily practice. And if you're like many of viewers who watched the film, you may have felt both inspired and kind of repulsed by Jiro's focused madness. So he achieved 3 Michelin stars through this dedication and modesty as this little shop inside of a subway station. But he also completely alienated his friends and his family and even his colleagues and apprentices in the process. And the obvious question, sort of moral of this film, is at what cost, this mastery of sushi? And if you kind of ask yourself, well, could you do this with anything? Could my daughter devote her life to step on a crack like Jiro has to sushi? Then the answer seems, well, no, obviously not. But then, why not? What is really the difference in a way? Is sushi or ceramic tile any less or more foolish than a plucked string instrument or an aristocratic Victorian lawn sport? It's really more a luxury to scoff at those who might have gone too far. It's much, much harder to care even a little about anything at all in the first place. It's just so much easier to hold it at arm's length or to ignore it or to reject it. And when you see people who've accepted those invitations instead, even the simplest, dumbest things reveal themselves to have these surprising and cavernous depths. A while back, an idiosyncratic British fellow named Thomas Thwaites built a toaster from scratch, beginning by mining the raw materials and ending with a product that he could have bought in a store for a few pounds sterling. And to do this, Thwaites formed a theory of the material essence of toasterness. I'm extremely jealous of this project, by the way. And his theory was that a toaster is steel and mica and plastic and copper and nickel. And then with this theory, he got to work. Immediately, problems arose. If you've ever tried to make a toaster, you'll empathize. Like extracting iron ore from long abandoned mines and smelting it into steel, or refining crude oil into malleable plastic. These are just not easy tasks for a single individual with no expertise or training. Manufacturing processes such as these typically disappear into the background, and we rely on them without thinking much about them. But what Thwaites did is he instead persisted, and he improvised specialized devices and processes in the pursuit of this goal. Some of them worked out better than others. He couldn't make steel, you'll forgive him, only iron, and eventually he abandoned the idea of like extracting sweet crude oil from the Earth's mantle, which presumably would have required some kind of terrifying makeshift oil drill and just obtained post-consumer waste plastic. And finally, miraculously, this object emerged. And it looks like a H.P. Lovecraft monster more than a kitchen appliance. Like this unholy toaster, and they plugged it in, and it worked for a few moments. It worked in the sense that it didn't rip the space-time continuum, and then the current melted the Browning element completely, and that's that. So like, what an amazing project that led to nothing in a way, at least not a functioning toaster. And what's the lesson? Well, toasters are more profound than you think, and they're everywhere too. I mean, you know this already. It doesn't take a philosopher to tell you that there are toasters, and yet toasters and their ilk are often considered a kind of joke, just a thing to ignore. What sort of madman cares this much about toasters? And shouldn't he have something better to do? But the problem is you can point that sneer at anything. This fear of ordinary life, it's not just limited to forgettable objects like toasters. It's everywhere. It's total. It's all around us. We're surrounded by all these things that we ignore and we lament, and it becomes harder and harder to tolerate any of them. Wouldn't it be better if anything whatsoever, anything that you find could bear meaning and pleasure rather than just a few select ones that we pre-pick as being capable of bearing meaning? Wouldn't that be a sign of respect rather than madness? And I bet that you actually respect more things in that way than you even realize. You just don't let them rise to the surface. So I started paying attention to some of mine, like loading the dishwasher. So the small glasses go on top, and you get it all full, and it's going to clean effectively, and your spouse isn't going to yell at you for overfilling it. And those are some of the daily processes. And I think about dishwashers a lot. But then I moved here, and everything I knew about dishwashers was lost because I got this new house and had a new dishwasher and had a new layout. But also, like, the prior owners of my house seemed to have allowed animals to crawl around inside it or something, as everything was bent and all the tines are pointing in different directions. And so now I have to relearn what a dishwasher is and how to use it. And isn't that terrifying and delightful? Or making coffee, I learned this ridiculous method for kind of fluffing and tamping the grounds to a particular measure of density, and then the moment you get it, then you run out of coffee, and then the new roast is slightly different, and so it requires a different grind or a different tamp. For a long time, I was using this bottomless portafilter so I could get my draw perfectly, but I've recently, it got very messy in my new place, and so I recently graduated back to the closed one, feeling some competence in my grind metrics, and all of this sort of Andy Rooney stuff, I used to mow the lawn. I got this manual mower a bunch of years ago, and I was like, I'm going to mow the lawn Dagwood style to reduce noise and pollution, connect myself to the physical environment, and it was a wreck. The manual blades would catch on the terrain, and I nevertheless found this sort of optimal angle before also, giving that up to acclimate to new lawns and new equipment and so on. And then, of course, I moved here to WashU, where I've been spending the majority of my time figuring out how students move through my programs and why the assumptions, faculty make about culture and progress, how, to remember to eat lunch at work after a year and a half of working from home. A place like ours, a university, it's like a city, and learning to work a new job is more like learning to live in a new city-state. So I can take new knowledge for granted, from the lesson that you actually really do have to go 35 miles per hour in Clayton to discovering that I think, at least, that student degree progress doesn't actually populate down to local records in a way that I can see. So all of this stuff, it may seem ridiculous to call these activities fun. It may seem just preposterous, but isn't it infinitely more ridiculous to imagine singing a Mary Poppins song to distract yourself from their supposed drudgery? What would be left? What tiny crease of life would remain after all the supposed chaff is shucked away? All the stuff that you get through so that you can get to the good stuff. What if all of it is the good stuff and we just can't bring ourselves to care or even to notice? But just as golf is hardly just a good walk spoiled, and lawn mowing and mall visiting and coffee brewing are more than chores or refreshments, they're these activities in their own rights, and the deliberate pursuit of them offers access not just to something tolerable, but something sublime. And feeling that something is fun, when you get that sensation, even if you don't know what it means, it's a good sign that you're on the right track, that you've given something respect. And likewise, when it doesn't feel fun, it's a sign that you haven't yet. And I know I'm guilty of that all the time. Like, aren't you too? We expect these things to come to us, to give us what we expect, while also showing us something totally new. We're constantly asking of everything and everyone, like, prove to me that you are worth my time. And then, like, moments later, we're already distracted. Like, sorry, it's too late. I've got better things to do. And certainly all of the kittens and memes and arguments on the internet don't help, because they make it so easy to select alternatives that give us exactly what we think we like or want or hate right away. But maybe it's all that stuff that doesn't meet us halfway or even part way. Maybe that's where the fun lives. There's more fun to be found there than in the ones that make us feel comfortable. So if we return to our new enemy, Mary Poppins, if I've done nothing else today, it's hopefully to turn you against Mary Poppins forever. It turns out that the thing that makes a job fun is not finding the element of fun that makes it a game, but finding the element of fun that makes it a job. Jobs are fun when they're not games or sports or commuting. And the more serious we become, the less generous we tend to become with that seriousness. Like, we withhold it or we're jealous of it. But what is there to lose, I ask you, by really and truly taking something as nothing other than what it is? You already had to empty the dishwasher or rake the leaves or run to Target. You already had to do it. We fail to have fun not because we don't take things seriously, but because we take them so seriously that we forgo attention to that seriousness. So play is working within limitations. Fun is finding novelty in familiarity. And games are just a proving ground for practicing that ability. They're like the aesthetic form of ordinary life. The real work of play is doing it anywhere and everywhere, massaging the octopus for 50 minutes because it makes the sushi more tender, or making a toaster precisely because you can buy one for a few pounds, committing to the consequences of tennis's rules even when they veer into absurdity, just to see where or if that absurdity ends. Play isn't distraction, not at all. It's attention. It's deep, respectful attention. So that is my theory of play for you, then. Giving respect to something that doesn't deserve it, becoming infatuated with that for which infatuation seems impossible, doing so by working that subject, which can be anything whatsoever, working it carefully and deliberately over time, absent expectation, but full of curiosity and trusting that it might yet blush before you and release its secrets. Thank you very much for your time.